So yeah, I mean, I'm honored to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to get to spend time with all of you. And I also wanted to say that I think it's really, so far, been a real inspiration to meet some of the people across campus here at University of Delaware who are developing a disability studies minor, an excellent series of classes and initiatives and organizations devoted to thinking about diversity as more than just a minimal requirement or an aspiration, but how does diversity actually work and how do we move towards and through diversity on a college campus. So I want to also thank the University of Delaware Center for the Study of Diversity and the University of Delaware English Department. And I want to thank Stephanie, one of my academic heroes, for this invitation. As I said, I think there's something really unique and important happening here. I think that it's important to think of diversity as more than just a set of statistics or photo opportunities, as an active, engaged, and research practice. And Stephanie has been filling me in on some of these things, but one thing I wanted to point out is this new National Science Foundation sponsored program to increase the recruitment, retention, and advancement of women faculty and women faculty of color. And I know that that group is also thinking about how those groups intersect with disability. I think that it's initiatives like that that in the future will do the most work to counter the, quote, academic eugenics that you'll see as part of my title. And I want to kind of return to that when we come to the end of the talk. So I am a reader from the page person. It's the only way that I can feel comfortable enough to put all my thoughts together. So I'm going to do a fair bit of reading. I'm not going to fill the hour with that because I really want to have time to have some discussion. I'll just get started. For several years I've been working on a big kind of maybe never-ending research project, and it started with archival research looking at the ways that disability was constructed through immigration processes and practices and discourses, even immigration spaces like the architecture of Ellis Island, and technologies like photography, and that peak period of immigration in between about 1900 and 1925, which was also, importantly, the peak period for eugenics in North America. So I'm going to talk to you about some of that research, and what I'm hoping to do is to try and kind of build a bridge between perhaps Ellis Island and even this university, to investigate the ways that eugenics exists at the foundation, really, of any college or university. So we'll see whether I can actually pull that off in a convincing way. You can let me know. So I want to start with the definition of eugenics. I think that the phenomenon or philosophy of eugenics, it's a kind of foundation for thinking of the body, and it's central to my talk. I define eugenics as the science, in scare quotes, of positively advocating for particular forms of human regeneration or procreation, coupled with the negative restriction of the propagation or procreation of certain classes and ethnicities. It's a way of controlling who lives, who procreates, and who dies, based on flawed ideas about our genetic makeup. And beginning at the turn of the 20th century, eugenics characterized and drove North American national health and immigration policies. Ellis Island itself was a really attractive site, offering a really attractive set of possibilities for eugenicists. In addition to the negative eugenic programs of sterilization, lynching, and so on, carried out over decades across the country, immigration was ideal for, and I know this is a strange phrase, but positive eugenics. There's nothing positive about it. But it was literally offering opportunities to control and edit the gene pool, using immigration stations as an elaborate sieve. Eugenics led to practices and processes that selected and sorted bodies into geographical areas, classes, and regimes of discipline. Eugenics also inspired genocide. And we see that through the ways that North American eugenic policies were picked up and used in, for instance, Germany. Eugenics was a philosophy, a dogma, a rhetoric, a religion. Beginning at the turn of the 20th century, eugenics was, quote, anointed guardian of American health and character, as Nancy Ordover has shown, constructing immigrants as both contaminated and contaminators. Angus MacLaren argues that for eugenicists, their final chief success wasn't necessarily even the drastic increase in restriction and deportation focused on specific groups of immigrants. It was in, quote, popularizing biological arguments. Not only did eugenic immigration restriction actually reshape the North American body, it reshaped how North Americans thought about bodies and minds. And it's that extension of eugenics as a practice into eugenics as a philosophy that I'm going to try and trace through this talk. So I've been able to develop theses about the ways in which the immigration stations at Ellis Island in the US, for instance, and at Pier 21 in Canada were in fact used as kind of laboratories for eugenicists. Immigration to eugenics proponents felt like the perfect experiment for shaping the racial future of America. I've tried to show that at Ellis Island, for example, the key triumph of eugenics was the creation of new categories of disability. And photography, and specifically photography, facilitated these inventions. So terms like moron and feeble-minded and idiot were terms that were created at Ellis Island to classify specific groups of immigrants. That's the genesis of those terms, which we now see as part of the popular idiom or lexicon. A regime of literacy and IQ testing, but also a regime of vision, was responsible for the solidification of these terms that are still used, despite their racist and pseudo-scientific roots. Perhaps the most overt example of this fusion can be found in the 1918 Manual of the Mental Examination of Aliens, published by the U.S. Public Health Service, for the use of medical officers performing medical examinations at Ellis Island. These images come from the pages of this manual, and what we're looking at here in the slide, there's something like 14 to 20 pages of these images, mostly men, although there are some women, and they're headshots. In the top left-hand corner we see a young man, and it's labeled Figure 2, low-grade imbecile, age 11 years. There's a set of hands coming from outside the frame to frame the face. On the top right-hand corner, Figure 4, a low moron, aged 30 years. It's a 20-year-old man with a mustache, seems to be wearing a suit jacket. Below him, I've crossed out my own figure there, my own label. Hold on one second. Oh, I can't. We'll skip that label. I can't remember which one it was. In the bottom left-hand corner, it's a young man. Figure 3, high-grade imbecile, age 17 years. So it wasn't just there wasn't just a set of terms distributed attached to something like a set of IQ scores. What there was a codified idea that you could look quickly at somebody's face and classify them along a scale of intelligence. And that's what I'm trying to show through this slide. And this was actually used for years by actual immigration inspectors at Ellis Island. So Walter Benjamin has argued that one of the earliest functions of photography was as a physiognomic tool, to catalog the human body in a way that translated embodied signs like these into insinuations of a mental hierarchy. The manual is a perfect example of this physiognomic photography. The document clearly outlines a visual grammar for discerning feeble-mindedness. This grammar providentially could lead inspectors to any number of possible rhetorical usages. So for instance, the manual warns that, and I'm going to read a longer quote here, "A great many feeble-minded persons on ordinary inspection present no physical signs whatever which would indicate real lack of intelligence. Nevertheless, the examiner should have made close examination of facial expressions, both in normal and abnormal persons, especially as to whether they might be gloomy, sad, anxious, apprehensive, elated, hostile, confused, sleepy, cyanotic, exalted, arrogant, conceited, restless, impatient, etc." You know, just those things. An examination of the photographs which appear herewith may prove interesting and instructive in this connection. And I've described those, the photographs here. So these protocols were produced and reproduced at Ellis Island, and these techniques, I think it's important to say, then rhetorically influenced the ways that everybody, not just inspectors, not just eugenics proponents, but also common citizens, looked at themselves and looked at one another. I'm going to talk about another small series of photographs that extended this work across American culture, particularly making non-white aliens a potential eugenic menace, a body and mind to be framed according to these same criminological, pathological, and even freak show reference. As Nancy Ordover explains, American eugenicists armed with charts, photographs, and even human skulls were there to provide the visual and mathematical support that rendered racism scientifically valid and politically viable. I've been working to show some of the key ways that photography provided this grounding. So beginning in 1905, there's an Ellis Island clerk named Augustus Sherman, and he has a camera. And he begins taking photographs of immigrants who have been detained because they're going to be deported. At that time, to take a photograph, you need a lot of time. Somebody has to be able to sit for an extended period of time. So it's perfect to have these people who are without a country, without a home, because they're forced to be there at Ellis Island. And they're also, importantly, exoticized or freakified by the fact that they've already been rejected. So he begins telling people, whenever you see anything strange, bring them to me, and I'll photograph them. So he did a whole series of what he called immigrant type photographs, which was a way of saying, here is a quick snapshot for you of a Russian Hebrew, a Hindu. And those immigrant type photographs become part of this manual for being able to discern who fits into what category. And there was even, this is a kind of digression, but there's a small passage in one of the manuals that talks about how if somebody says they're from a certain place and yet they look like they're from one of these other places, that's a sign of deficiency. What's interesting to me about that is that there's just such a desire to categorize and sort that seemed to trump even somebody's real nationality. And the idea that if you don't look like everybody else should look from where you're from, you're probably deficient in some way. Okay, so the other thing about those photographs is just that they became really, really popular. At the time, they were on postcards. They were big framed photographs in the hallway of the administrators' offices at the immigration offices for immigration, and they were also circulated in National Geographic magazine on 2 different occasions. So I think I want to connect this to this ongoing rhetoric of eugenics and talk about how, I'm going to make a kind of jump here, but there's something happening at this point in time that this categorization catalyzes. And that is that there's a desire now not just to know where someone came from, but to be able to recognize finer distinctions within racial groups, right? Especially all of the different new ways there were to not be white, right? Matthew Fried Jacobson talks about this as the concept of, quote, variegated whiteness. It was important to be able to mark ethnic others, even if they may have been previously understood as white, as now somehow not authentically or fully white. He explains that, quote, the salient feature of whiteness before this era had been its powerful political and cultural contrast to non-whiteness. Yet artifacts like Sherman's photographs reveal how, quote, its internal divisions too took on a new and pressing significance. In his estimation, texts like the manual offered, quote, fundamentally a hierarchical scale of human development and worth based on this idea of both marking out non-whiteness and on selective distinctions in a field of variegated whiteness. The process manufactured brand new populations of non-whites or not fully whites, and Sherman's pictures further help people to see these new populations and to define the American through the creation of the alien. So these are 2 of Sherman's photographs. The image on your right pictures 3 men. They're on the roof of an Ellis Island building, which is a common backdrop for these photographs. At the left, seated on a bench, we see a man with his head turned to the right, wearing a knee-length jacket. Beside him, another man stands on the bench so as to draw attention to his smaller stature. He stands at about the same head level as the seated man. He's wearing an ankle-length jacket with fur trim, and his chin is raised in the air. On the far right, we see a third man also standing on the bench and just slightly taller than the man in the middle of the picture. He wears a turban, and his head is larger than those of the other two men. He also wears an ankle-length coat, and he holds in his hands on his waist. The image is labeled Subramino Pillay, right, and 2 microcephalics. This image, the other image, shows a side angle of Perumal Sami, and the handwritten notation at the top of this photo suggests he was, quote, certified for congenital deformity of the abdomen, 2 arms and legs being joined at the abdomen. He wears a long jacket opened at the front, where a pair of legs and arms, bound and partially covered with silk, are shown to be attached to his stomach. He has a mustache, long hair, and a hat perched at the very top of his head. I should know the term for that hat. In any case, these were the photographs that were handed out as postcards. These were the photographs that were circulated in National Geographic to show the work that Ellis Island was doing in the early part of the 20th century. And you can imagine that it's not just a kind of freak show sentiment that makes these attractive. It's also the idea that Ellis Island is serving its function, that it's keeping these people out, right? And I think that that's a kind of neglected part of the history of American immigration. When you go to Ellis Island now, you can go and find these photographs in the archives. But what most people are there for is to trace their family history, the positive family history of having been accepted, right? Having made their way through that space. And it's an ironic experience to go to Ellis Island because you're traveling on a boat from Manhattan, instead of from the other direction, out to Ellis Island. And actually, when you look around the boat, you realize that at the period of peak immigration, most of the people on that boat would not have been welcome to even land at Ellis Island. So that's also part of the story that gets glossed over. Okay, so yeah. All right. So in other projects, I do a kind of careful examination of how images like these from Sherman were reproduced and circulated, as I said, through popular books. There's a very popular book at the time called Aliens or Americans, and it's a religious tract, a kind of currently we would call it like a New York Times bestseller. It was a bestseller in that period, and it really was a didactic kind of educational text that used Sherman's photographs, especially of immigrant types, to talk about who was and who was not American. From the title of the book alone, you can imagine that it's mostly about who's not. That's a form of definition of what America was going to be and become. So I think that the key to these photographs and his kind of rendering of the deviance of others is the fact that this reading of the body's signs was connected to a clear nationalist project at Ellis Island. As mentioned before, while the photographs are part of a program of assimilation, they're also a part of a project of abjection. The photographs construct a binary relationship between the American viewer or reader and the alien subject, a ghostly national type as the inverse of an array of alien and defective types. The larger thesis, of course, is that we all carry Ellis Island and this history with us today. We're subject to the same sort of gaze, governed by the same rhetorical vision. Being processed through Ellis Island, whether you were deported or not, taught you how to look at yourself and how to look at others. I think a somewhat larger leap that I'm hoping to make, and I'll make a connection near the end of my talk, is that the actual technology of photography developed from the very beginning as an ableist and eugenicist tool. I think that studying these photographs together with the rhetorical space of Ellis Island and the discursive explosion of eugenics allows us to recognize unique and complicated connections between spaces, words, images, and bodies. As bleak and kind of pessimistic as the message may be, I also think that studying these texts allows us to recognize the historical and the current predominance of specific visual rhetorics. The study should allow us to view the other ways that through technologies like photography or through other explosions of media, we continue to frame and develop race and disability as we freeze and arrest difference. So to give a kind of quick history here, around 1924, President Harding passed the National Origins Act, and basically this big wave of immigration, the door shut. It closed down. That act, as Roger Daniels has written, quote, wrote the assumptions of the Immigration Restriction League and other nativist and eugenicist groups into the statute book of the United States. The eugenic message here was also very clear. Prescott Hall, writing on behalf of the Immigration Restriction League, simply stated that America must, quote, exclude the black, the brown, and the yellow altogether. As to the white, favor the immigration of Nordic and Nordicized stock. We need to become and to remain a strong, self-reliant, united country with only the unity that counts, that of race. And this is essentially what the Johnson-Reed Act and then this National Origins Act did. These developments were celebrated by eugenicists on both sides of the ocean, from Henry Laughlin to Adolf Hitler. An interesting sort of side note is that President Harding's own rise to power was fueled by this immigration restriction. He made a famous speech in 1920 on the topic of readjustment, and at that point he coined, or maybe it was a kind of malapropism, the term normalcy to describe an idealized state attainable once America was again at peace and had closed its doors to foreigners. While many believe that the use of the term normalcy was a lexical mistake, the word perhaps nicely summed up a new system of making normal. Of particular note was Harding's strong push for, quote, not submergence in internationality, but sustainment in triumphant nationality. He was referring here to both the end of the war overseas and the end of the stream of immigration. He promised to close the gates, and he did close the gates. So, yeah, that's the kind of history lesson piece of it. But I think what's remarkable about this normalcy that Ellis Island spawned in the United States was not that racist and eugenic sentiments and policies were new, but that now the mechanisms for marking out difference and thus fortifying the normal position only ever in contrast were multiplied. While the National Origins Act was blunt and finite, the bodily attitudes interpolated at Ellis Island or learned at Ellis Island were nuanced, and they expanded and multiplied. So I want to pause to say this. Eugenics is not a historical narrative. Eugenics is a contemporary rhetoric. Post-1924, eugenics became a widespread projection of Ellis Island across the entire country. The rhetoric surrounding this process and spectacle helped to inculcate normalcy, to bury systems of downward comparison and stigmatization into the citizen psyche. When Harding used the term normalcy, he solidified an ongoing rhetorical reality. America and North America had defined and would continue to define itself most successfully by what it rejected, not by what it was. Within a year of the 1924 Act, the Commissioner of Immigration at Ellis Island, Henry Curran, reported proudly, though ridiculously, that, quote, all immigrants now look exactly like Americans. The dangerous hope and the seeming lack of logic in a statement such as this nicely sums up the frantic play for normalcy and the tragic comedy of this drama. To say that all immigrants now look like Americans simply reveals that, all along, the idea of Americanness was an opportunistic projection. Restrictionists shifted more emphasis now to the deportation of new Americans within the country, communists and other threats, and the eugenic focus shifted to the lower classes within America, maintaining racial and ethnic prejudice that had been defined and applied already. One specific relocation for Ellis Island as a rhetorical space has been the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S.-Mexico Border Patrol was founded on May 28, 1924. 3 days after the passage of the National Origins Act. And it fits with Harding's talk about triumphant nationalism, right? Not internationalism. As Kyle Lytle Hernandez has shown, the patrol to this day allows for, quote, the perseverance of racially differentiated systems of coercive force. Racial profiling by the Border Patrol is a wormhole of racial domination, a practice in which past articulations, like those I've been talking about, of white supremacy live in the present. In this way, Ellis Island lives on in current American anti-immigration rhetoric, which there's been a lot of public discourse about over the last 3 or 4 days. If people have been listening to NPR or watching CNN, there was even a long speech on Fox News, which I caught because I was in a hotel room just last night, about the history, linking present attitudes about immigration to a long history of attitudes about immigration, which is eye-opening because that's not what usually happens. So I think it's also been shown that it's no coincidence that, quote, the kind of eugenics inflected revulsion against mongrelization that informed congressional immigration debates leading up to these crackdowns also triggered an expansion of and hardening of state anti-miscegenation laws, including, again in 1924, the Virginia law, which powerfully strengthened the nation's substantial body of racially and eugenically based marriage laws. On March 20th, 1924, the Virginia legislature passed 2 closely related eugenics laws, SB 219, entitled the Racial Integrity Act, and SB 281, an act to provide for the sexual sterilization of inmates of state institutions in certain cases, referred to as the Sterilization Act. The alien feeble-minded became larger targets within the country as eugenic sterilization became widespread. By 1932, 30 states had sterilization statutes on the books, thanks in large part to the rhetoric of immigration restriction. In the United States, there were 70,000 total known sterilizations between 1907 and the end of World War II, and they didn't stop at World War II. Eugenic anti-immigration rhetoric reached into the bodies of those racialized others, made alien within the country. The integrity of racial groups could be qualified and policed in multiple overlapping ways. For instance, sterilization was always explicitly linked to class, and black Americans were specifically targeted for sterilization when they could also be labeled as mentally defective, because they were then seen as more likely to be sexually promiscuous and to thus breed interracially. Ellis Island's rhetorical success allowed Americans to pick up the border, so to speak, and lay it down across the bodies of thousands of others within the country. There are other real connections to be made here, and Ellis Island becomes part of the story again, because at this period there's a real fear of communism. And Ellis Island becomes a place where suspected communists are sent and warehoused with a complete lack of rights, just like those people who were being photographed, and also very much like people who are being detained in ICE centers currently. And although Delaware is one of the only states that doesn't have an ICE detention center, some of the largest and most problematic in the country are nearby in New Jersey. Okay. A thing I think to take away from that is that through this history, disability, the ways that we understand disability now were constructed through this history, and also inflect the ways that we understand race now. And I want to add one more personal image to the archive. Whoops, I went back. So this is my uncle Robert. And in the image, he's wearing footy pajamas, right, which are pajamas that have the feet on them, and he's sitting in a chair. Kind of looking at the camera, there's a door behind him. When my mom was about 9 years old, her mother was pregnant, and my mother was preparing to have a new baby brother. Her mom went to the hospital to have the baby, but the baby never came home. My Uncle Robert was born, most likely, although this was never a diagnosis, now that we've seen all of his paperwork, he most likely had Down syndrome. The doctors told my grandmother that she really had no other option but to send Robert away to an institution. My grandmother also then refused to talk about Robert ever again. My mom grew up missing her brother, and she found out that he died at the Huronia Regional Center, an institution in Orillia, Ontario, before he was 10 years old. So when she was later able to get this picture, which is the only picture there is of him from his files. We've since discovered that dozens of kids at the institution died the same month that he did, all from simple colds that progressed into pneumonia. In fact, when we look back through the files, there is a my uncle was treated by the same doctor every time that there's an entry in his medical file. He's being treated by the same doctor until the last month of his life when there's a brand new doctor that comes in. And it's the same pattern happens with several other kids who died that same month. This was a long time ago. My mom became a social worker when she grew up, and her first job was actually back at this institution, where she discovered horrible conditions. Other people saw them too, but very few tried to do anything about them. My mom left the job, but stayed connected with many people from this institution, including two women named Patricia Seth and Marie Slark. Last fall, my parents acted as litigation guardians for Pat and Marie in a class action lawsuit that was settled with the government of Ontario, and the government admitted to the abuse experienced by those who lived at the institution. I actually grew up in the small town where this institution was. It was the main employer in town. It was really the only employer in town. And going out with my brother Matt, who was himself disabled in Orillia, people always looked at us. I didn't know this for a while, but I can look back and understand it now. People always looked at us like he was on a day pass from the institution. And entire families in this town were kind of grounded and supported on the idea that people with disabilities should be warehoused out of sight and could be treated as less than human. Orillia was actually, when I think about it now, a thoroughly eugenic place. Its main industry warehoused a huge group of people to keep them out of the gene pool and out of sight, and so the entire town was invested in those values. I hope that some of that experience underpins or puts into relief my push to try and find the neglected stories throughout history. It's an impulse that, for me, starts at home. I've also always tried, when I'm writing and researching about other institutions like the college or the university, to remember that they have historically been grounded in their inverse image, in the places where difference and disability were sequestered and where life chances weren't portioned out but were taken away. My current project centers on trying to connect eugenic history with what is actually happening on campuses and classrooms at the modern North American university, even at places like the University of Delaware or my own institution, the University of Waterloo. Just as Orillia had its Huronia Regional Center, originally called the Orillia Asylum for Idiots, the state of Delaware had the Delaware State Hospital at Farnhurst, originally called the Insane Department and Hospital, a place where tuberculosis patients were also housed. And this is an image of this hospital, the Delaware State Hospital. Like buildings at the University of Delaware, it's a Georgian Revival building, red Flemish bond brickwork, white wood trim. This looks like a University of Delaware building. Going back through the history over the last few weeks, I found out that when the Green was being built, they drove around the state of Delaware to look for other buildings as examples. It's quite likely that this was one of the examples that the actual architecture at the University of Delaware was based upon. So that's part of the history here too. I spoke earlier about the ways that eugenic control on the borders slowly spread into forms of more regionalized control in which negative and positive eugenic programs were developed from state to state. Delaware was again no exception. In fact, Delaware was a model of eugenic efficiency. There were almost 1,000 sterilizations in Delaware. Of the victims, 50% were female and 50% were male. Close to 1/3 of those sterilized were considered mentally ill, while more than 2/3 were considered mentally deficient. During the peak sterilization period of 1927 and 1937, Delaware sterilized an average of 18 people per 100,000 state residents per year. And Delaware sterilizations continued long past World War II. That's important to say because I think for most people, if they're willing to admit that America had a eugenics period, they believe that it would have stopped once we saw what happened in Germany, and it didn't. So, in fact, 30% of these sterilizations occurred after World War II, and Delaware was ranked as having the highest sterilization rate in the country in both the late 1940s as well as late as 1962, 1963. Delaware sterilization laws included habitual criminals, those who were chronically insane, inmates of mental institutions who were insane, feeble-minded, or epileptic, and those committing criminal acts in or outside of Delaware as a result of mental defectiveness. Homosexual men were also victimized because they were considered to be suffering from a mental deficiency. After being arrested for taking part in homosexual activity, many were sent to mental institutions where they could be involuntarily sterilized. Additionally, laws existed preventing the marriage of the insane or those who had been in an insane asylum. By law, Delaware, and this is curious, also had one of the only laws against the marriage of two, quote, poor people. Very eugenic, right? The idea is you're a poor person because that's your genetic lot in life, and you shouldn't mate with somebody else who has that same genetic stamp. So I was just in Philadelphia over the weekend, and while I was there, I was recalling an earlier trip to the city to do research at the American Philosophical Society archives, which is where most of the records of the Eugenics Society of America are kept. If you feel like doing research that will just absolutely devastate you, go ahead and have a look there. There's tons of literature. And it just the sheer impact of it and the reach of the proponents of eugenics into every arm of especially elite American life is overwhelming. And you really do realize it was a huge part of the fabric of the culture in America in that period. So there you can see reams of correspondence between the society and professors and administrators at the nation's top universities, where the society was hoping there could be a curriculum built around key eugenic principles. One project had the goal of getting every undergraduate in America to write out their own family tree, both as a form of research so that the Eugenics Society could learn exactly what genetic stock was being educated, but also as a form of kind of Foucauldian discipline, a way to increase students' self-awareness of their own eligibility or non-eligibility for procreation. I did a little digging and I found two specific courses taught at UD. The first was called Heredity and Eugenics 303. A study of the fundamentals of Mendelian heredity and human inheritance, including a consideration of the factors underlying race betterment and race deterioration, taught at least from 1920 to 1921. I also found this genetics course, B12, quote, a study of heredity, and I'm showing this on a slide here, a study of heredity with a special reference to the methods and results of recent investigations and their application to eugenics. It's taught by Dean Robinson, who I believe was Dean Winifred Robinson, the first dean of the Women's College, and from what I can tell, a very significant figure in the history of the university. Maybe one of these buildings is named after her? In any case. So, more recently, also in the early 1990s, a pair of researchers at Delaware, Gottfredson and Blitz, were embroiled in a national scandal over the acceptance of research funds from the Pioneer Fund, an organization widely believed to actively promote neo-eugenic practices. And there's a book called The Funding of Scientific Racism by William Tucker that offers an overview of the Pioneer Fund. But my intent here, I want to say, is not to single out the University of Delaware. The truth is, I could do this digging and find the exact same things at my own institution, which I have, and lots of other places, almost every state university. You can find that historical evidence of eugenics nearly anywhere you look, and especially at any institution of higher education in North America. When you look at the overview of the institution at Farnhurst and the overview of University of Delaware, you also see that it's part of the land grant movement, that the creation of these elite spaces and the parceling out of land for these elite spaces is often immediately adjacent to and consonant with the parceling out of land where other people were supposed to be contained and kept out of the gene pool. So there was a recent story that people may have seen in the news. The University of Mississippi discovered a graveyard on land it was clearing to build a medical center. In clearing the land, they found over 1,000 unmarked graves, believed to be those of patients at the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum. The shock registered in news stories seemed to be that this discovery would halt the building of the medical center, right? Not about anything else. And I just wanted to raise that because the other thing about Farnhurst is that behind those buildings there are also a series of unmarked graves, numbered graves. And at Huronia Regional Center, where my uncle passed away, they actually had all of the unmarked graves, and at some point in time somebody came and flipped them over and turned them into a patio. So there was a real effort, I think it just speaks to how devalued, even after death, these bodies were, these people were. Okay, so I want to give lots of time for us to have a discussion, so I'm going to skip over a few different things. I need you to trust me that when I say I'm not singling out the University of Delaware, I'm not. I was about to go into a thing about Harvard and Stanford. The founders of Harvard and the founders of Stanford, including David Starr Jordan, were prominent eugenicists. There was research based at Harvard using, in a direct relationship between the university and the mental institution, taking the bodies and cadavers from the mental institution and using them for scientific experiments. But they also called the institution the zoo, because they could go there and get pictures of a wide variety of different medical anomalies. And those are the pictures that are still in a lot of medical textbooks. At MIT, there was a group that used inmates at Rentham, which was an asylum, for nuclear testing. So there's other people who are writing about this history, and it's very much a part of the fabric of the development of knowledge. So the way to say it maybe is, the development of knowledge in one place required the study of a certain set of bodies in another place. Okay, so, all right. Okay, so the thing to say is that I think it's easy to think that eugenics was a historical thing, that it's been rejected and corrected, and I think it's important to start to interrogate the ways that academia still continues to parcel out privilege in particular ways. So I have, I have a digression that I want to talk about before I end. I'm working on another project that's looking at, it builds on this, but it's looking at the ways disability appears in movies about college campuses, from like Back to School to Old School to Monsters University. And just this morning I was out walking around with my son, and I thought, The Social Network is the perfect movie about eugenics and American universities. So here's what I was thinking. In The Social Network, which is a movie about Facebook and about Mark Zuckerberg, who founded Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg comes to university expecting that the women on his elite college campus should all be available to him. And when he's spurned, he and his friends go on a coding frenzy, right, to create a technology. And remember, this is how Facebook began. It began as Face Mash, right, which was a way to rank the hotness of Harvard girls. It was a technology designed to rank co-eds using their faces as a baseline for insinuations of their sexual and embodied desirability and undesirability. So this is an image, a screenshot of Face Match. And we see two young women, and it's above, you're encouraged to choose who's hotter, click to choose. So it's an actual algorithm, right, for ranking bodies. And I can't help but think about that and also think back to the ways that photography was used in a space like Ellis Island. This, when you think about it, this is kind of the key technological innovation of the 21st century. A true and consistent elaboration of the ways photography was used eugenically at the beginning of the 20th century, except now we don't need Augustus Sherman to take the pictures because we can take them ourselves. So maybe this digression is something, because it's a new thought, as you can tell. I just had it this morning. I hope it's something we can talk about through the Q&A, and you all can help me think about a little bit more. And I want to end just by saying that what I'm hoping to do is to actually encourage us all to rethink and interrogate and remap the spaces and interfaces of the North American University, analyzing the ways that these institutions that we're a part of have structured society by limiting access and reorganizing undesirable traits and bodies, as well as the ways that we might more actively, inclusively design our teaching and pedagogy and learning in response to and with an awareness of this history and this architecture. So I encourage you to both map a particular spatial history and to forge a set of tactics that might allow you to reform and revise and re-embody these patterns and routines. I encourage you to search for ways to recast the rhetoric of disability, and therefore to reshape our relationships with our own embodiment, with others, and with our critical differences. Thank you.